Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Eli McCann. Welcome to the podcast, Eli.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're recording here in our home in Salt Lake City on a beautiful spring day. I'm kind of glad winter's over. Let me introduce Eli, and then I'll give him a chance to sort of make sure that a rough bio is okay. And then I want to talk about why I'm doing a podcast with someone in a same-sex marriage. But Eli, I've known about Eli for quite a while. He's a Twitter legend. We'll link to his Twitter bio in the show notes. You can connect with Eli. But Eli's 37 years old. He grew up in Salt Lake City area, South Jordan, Bingham High. Has an undergraduate degree at BYU, also a graduate degree at law school at BYU. He served a mission in Ukraine, and we will probably talk about that. He's been part of a major fundraiser here in Utah that raised $155,000. Well, I think that will come up in the podcast, just the good work that he and others are doing to raise money for the Ukraine people. He professionally is a lawyer here in Salt Lake City with an established law firm. And he also, as a side gig, if this is the right vocabulary, teaches law at the University of Utah. Would you call it a side gig or your main thing?
A side gig, I like that. Almost a hobby, yeah.
How many classes do you teach?
I just teach one class. I teach First Amendment, specifically the religion clauses of the First Amendment.
That's awesome. Do you get good parking?
I get decent parking. I park right at the stadium just next to the law school.
You get one of those special non-student passes.
I'm not that special, no.
Well, I wish you got a really good pass.
Yeah, me too.
As I mentioned, Eli, how long have you and your husband, Skylar, been married?
We've been married almost 3 years.
And you could hear a little bit more about Eli's story on the Questions from the Closet podcast, episode 74. I listened to that this morning. It's a terrific podcast titled, How Should I Come Out to My Family? We may touch on some of that. But I thought it was a terrific podcast, just how you came out to your family. Terrific insights, and including, I want to just touch on this because it's something I stopped this morning in my walk and texted to myself, is the tone of coming out to your family set the tone for the whole conversation. That do you remember that concept in that podcast? Just start there, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I've talked about for a number of years with people, especially I've had closeted people come to me and ask for advice of how do I come out to my family? What is the best way to do this? And one of the big things that I have really tried to help other people feel or understand that I thought was really helpful to me is that sometimes we approach those conversations in a way like we think we're sharing bad news with the world. And we sort of walk into it in this negative space where it's I need to tell you something about myself, and I hope you can still see me the same way after this. And that sets a tone that is really difficult to overcome. And for me specifically, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, but I had to get myself into a really positive headspace before I felt comfortable coming out. And specifically, I needed to see my coming out as good news and not bad news. I'm a gay man. And for me, at this point in my life, that is one of my favorite things about myself. I wouldn't trade that. And so going into that conversation with a tone of, I have something I want to share with you, and I'm excited to share this with you, and I'm excited to bring you into this part of my life, sets such a different stage with our family members and friends than that negative sort of, I hope that you can still see me the same way type of tone.
I thought that was just terrific. So please check out episode 74 of Questions from the Closet. Ben Shalati's pretty open that he was not like you when he came out to his family.
Yeah.
And I just was very interesting to hear that. Listeners, I'm an active Latter-day Saint. Some would say, well, why are you having a guest on your podcast that's in a same-sex marriage? Obviously, that's outside of the teachings of our church. And I just want to kind of talk about that. I want to see us all as the same human family, and Eli and I are members of the same human family. I also like this concept, unity and diversity, that we can be unified even if we're different. And I think what you've done with the Ukraine fundraiser is a great example of that, is we became unified for greater, holier causes. I also, listeners, attended my 40th high school reunion. That's a long ways off, Eli, for you, but for me, that happened recently. And I was probably aware of the couple of gay men. I didn't know how to interact with them. All I knew was kind of withdraw. And there were probably three or four, but at our high school reunion, we did a slideshow of all those that were gone. And every one of those men were gone.
Hmm.
And the couple that I knew about, the only sort of path they knew, Eli, in 1979 when I graduated, was sort of going to big metro cities. That's probably the only place they felt they could belong.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize with legal same-sex marriage being legal, that opens a door that wasn't open to the people of my age. And you will be at your 40th high school reunion,
Mm-hmm.
and you will bring your husband. And I just sort of mourned as I saw those faces come up. And so I'm glad that you have a path that people my age in 1979 didn't. I think your story will help others make an informed decision. There's a lot of Latter-day Saint, gay and lesbian that are kind of at this fork in the road. You know the different choices that you can make. And I invite people to make a really informed decision. Of course, I'll invite everybody to follow church teachings, but part of the doctrine I believe in is you have agency to decide your best path forward. And I'm going to support you and walk with you. And that kind of leads to my next thought. I'm not going to make you the hero today and the villain tomorrow. That's one of the reasons I want you on the podcast, because you're the same wonderful human being. I didn't know you, back when you served your mission in Ukraine, but you're the same really good person, contributing to our society, helping. And I don't want to see this shift that sometimes occurs when someone goes from celibate and fully participating in the church to into same-sex marriage, and we sort of make you the hero one day and the villain the next day. I want to humanize people like you. So that's a little bit about why I want listeners to hear your story. Are you okay with all that? Or do you have any thoughts to clarify or add or subtract?
I think we're good. Thank you. And I am about to take my husband to my 20th high school reunion this summer. And it's 10 years ago when I was at the 10-year high school reunion, I didn't imagine that this would be my 20-year high school reunion experience. But I'm obviously really grateful that it is.
Yeah. And I like the idea that if you're going to choose this road, you're going to be in a sort of a monogamous, long-term relationship. There's lots of ways to sort of do this, but I think, sort of being in a same-sex relationship, but I like where you and Skylar are. In a monogamous, committed, long-term relationship. Is that the right vocabulary, Eli, I'm using?
Yeah. I think for me, I have always in my life valued the idea of marriage, and part of what was really heartbreaking about, becoming an adult and realizing that I am gay and this isn't going away was maybe I'm never going to be able to have that thing that I've always wanted, which is marriage, that family. And for me, it was such a beautiful experience to then get to a point where I realized that, no, I actually could have that. There was an avenue for me to have that. And it was through marrying Skylar, who's a terrific husband who drives me absolutely crazy and makes me laugh all the time. And it's a relationship that is fulfilling and beautiful in all of the ways that I had always hoped I would eventually find.
I love that. And listeners, as you check out, and some of you may be on Eli's Twitter feed, one of the things is you normalize this relationship. The things you joke about on Twitter with your husband are the same things that straight couples joke about. It's sort of, that's one of the things that I love about your Twitter feed and people really pick up on that.
Yeah, well, it is a normal relationship, and it's there are, relationships come in all shapes and sizes, of course. My marriage with Skylar looks very similar to a lot of the straight marriages that I'm familiar with in my life. In fact, my marriage to Skylar looks a lot like my parents' marriage and his parents' marriage in a lot of ways. We see that we have fully become our parents in a lot of ways. And so, I'm a storyteller. I like jokes. I like telling humorous stories. And part of the really fun thing about being married to Skylar is he provides me a lot of great content. And so it's such a joy for me to be able to share what I find to be kind of the fun parts of our marriage with the rest of the world.
One of the things when I first started to connect with this space, and then I want to have you kind of start your story chronologically. Maybe you can take us
Mm,
back to high school and coming to awareness of your sexual orientation. Is I used to see this phrase, the gay lifestyle, and then somebody showed me a billboard that said the gay lifestyle, and it said Monday, do the wash, Tuesday, go out to dinner, Wednesday, and it just sort of normalized um, a same sex marriage, the same as a straight marriage, that we kind of do the same things
mhm,
in these marriages. And that's one of the things your Twitter feed is sort of normal, because it is just to your point. So,
mhm. Yeah.
but take us back to wherever you want to start. You could start in high school and come, or you could start in college, wherever you want to start, just maybe chronologically, is just you're aging up and
Yeah.
becoming aware of your sexual orientation.
Yeah. Well, what I'll say is, I think people kind of figure out that they're gay at different ages and in different ways. And a lot of that depends on what kind of exposure you have to different types of people. I was in kindergarten and was well aware that I had crushes on the boys in class and not the girls. And there was something within me. I didn't know what gay people were. This is 1989 or whatever year that was. I didn't know what gay people were. I lived in Utah, was sheltered in that way, but I somehow had the wisdom to know that I shouldn't tell other people this. I just kind of somehow knew like this isn't quote unquote normal, and so I just really kept it to myself as a child. And I went through elementary school and middle school always knowing that I had crushes on the boys and not the girls. And I think there was a little part of me that wondered, well, maybe this is something that will just kind of change over time. I don't know. But by the time I was really kind of in the middle of middle school, uh, that curiosity or that realization started to turn to fear. And there was a lot of fear. And I started having these experiences where I was having chronic stomach aches at school that baffled my teachers and baffled my parents. And nobody really knew what was causing them. And I, of course, was going through just severe anxiety over the fact that, wait a minute, like something's wrong with me. I think, this is something that's wrong. And what does this mean for my future? And it was around middle school, around that time, that I really first started figuring out that gay people existed in the first place. I would see depictions of them in media, and they weren't good depictions. This is the 90s. I would see sort of conversation about how gay people were wrong, or this was a thing that was wrong. And, mind you, this is back at a time when neither of the major political parties were really supportive of LGBTQ rights. And so there was sort of a national consensus that treated this thing like it was a sickness, that it was something that was really wrong and really bad. And then, of course, I was also simultaneously receiving church messaging that was, at that time in the 90s, the lessons that I was receiving were, well, Satan, one of the things that Satan is trying to do is convince people that they're born gay. But no, of course, nobody is born gay. People choose to be gay, and that's a wicked choice. And so I was hearing that kind of messaging. And I remember just so vividly sitting in Sunday school lessons and hearing my teachers say that and believing it myself and thinking, okay, I don't know exactly what that means for me because I don't feel like I chose this, but apparently I wasn't born this way. So I've done something wrong along the way. And here I am, 13 years old, feeling like there was something that it was just inherently wrong with me. And so this was a really, I think, a very difficult, challenging part of my life, growing through those teenage years and really grappling with that and dealing with just unbelievable, crippling anxiety over what all of that felt like. And so by the time I, graduated high school, I went and did a year of college, and then went and served a mission in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine. And going on a mission almost felt like a relief in some ways because it felt like I was getting a 2-year break from having to think about this. It was 2 years where nobody was pressuring me to go on dates. And in fact, I wasn't even allowed to think about going on dates. And it was 2 years where I could just focus on something else. And hopefully at the end of those 2 years, I would come out with some kind of realization that would help me figure out how I was supposed to navigate the rest of my life. And so I did this 2-year mission in Ukraine. It was, something that I am very, very happy that I did. It connected me to a people and a culture and some experiences that have been very valuable to me throughout the last couple of decades. And it gave me some, life experience that I think has been really valuable to me as well. But when I came back from Ukraine and got back to the United States, there was waiting for me this terror once again. And that terror was, well, now what are you going to do? Because now you've entered the phase in your religious culture where you're supposed to date women and find one to marry as quickly as possible. There's a certain pressure to do that. And there was nothing that sounded worse in the world to me than finding a woman to marry. And yet I so desperately wanted marriage and I wanted a family, but not in the way that I was being pushed toward. And over those next few years, as I was in college, I just sort of had that anxiety continue to build and grow and that fear. And I would have these experiences where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and just this absolute panic and absolute terror. Terror is the only word that I think I can really use to adequately describe it, because I just thought, well, what is my plan here? I know that I can't marry a woman. I know that I can't do that. I can't do that to a woman. I can't do that to myself. I felt like that just felt like a thing that I myself could not do. And so if I'm not doing that, then I guess I'm just alone for the rest of my life, because at that point I certainly was not even remotely considering leaving the church. That in my mind I thought I will always be, in this church that I love, and so I'm just alone for the rest of my life, which sounded absolutely terrible. And also, being alone for the rest of my life wasn't a part of the plan of salvation that I believed so firmly in, and so it was just sort of several years of just thinking through that circle over and over again and just wondering, well, what is my life? It's only gotten more and more depressing as I've gotten older. And is it just going to continue getting worse and worse and worse until I die and that's it? And all to what end? I didn't end up living the plan of salvation anyway because I didn't build this family. And so my biggest coping mechanism through all of that was I just wanted to distract myself as much as possible. And the way I would distract myself is, well, I'll take on as many activities as I can in my life. I had a full class load, of course, in school. I was during college working 3 jobs. I participated in clubs. I fulfilled my callings dutifully and just kept myself as busy as possible. Because if I had, all of these tasks that I was having to run through, then it was sort of a way to keep my mind from that terror. And I graduated college and then went to law school immediately and did the same through my 3 years of law school. I just took on as much as I possibly could, kept myself as busy as I possibly could. And by the time law school ended, I was sort of seeing that graduation date as a terrifying deadline, because I thought, well, I've been able to distract myself with education as much as I can. But once I finish this, then I just move into true adulthood. I get my, whatever 9-to-5 job, and then I just live alone for the rest of my life. And then, what? And that was an extremely terrifying thing for me. And so I graduated law school in 2011. And it was finally then when I graduated that I truly began the very, very slow and painful process of coming out to myself and then coming out to others and figuring out what to do with my faith around that. So in late 2011, I started finally, I wasn't ready to have a conversation with myself about what my relationship with the church would look like. I still firmly had in my mind, I always have to stay in the church. But I finally let myself start thinking about, okay, would it be helpful at some point to at least acknowledge that you are gay and tell other people? And, up to that point, up until 2011, I was never once tempted to tell anybody that I was gay. I wouldn't even put those words really in my own mind. But I finally started thinking, maybe at some point this is something that I should address. And that, looking back, over a decade later, that almost feels a little bit silly to me, that felt like progress at the time. Just having the thought of maybe one day, maybe I'll tell somebody about this, that felt like such a huge advancement for me. And so I had at that time moved to Salt Lake City. I worked for a year for a judge. I had a good time with that job, but was really struggling with this part of myself. And I decided after that year that I really wanted to just get away from Utah for a little bit. I felt like I needed to get away from everybody that I knew. I needed to kind of take a break from being around the space and the people that I was used to, and go somewhere to just have some quiet time to figure out what is my plan, what is my path. So I took a job in Palau, which is a country in the equatorial Pacific near the Philippines. And it was a legal job. I was legal counsel for the judiciary of Palau. It was an odd job on this very tiny tropical island. And it was a very, very difficult year in a lot of ways. But I went to Palau. I actually went to Palau with somebody that I was in sort of a closeted relationship with, whom I had just met right before going to Palau. He came with me, and the two of us sort of lived in this kind of messy space together. We were both me more than he was. We were both still in the church. We were still attending church. We were kind of in this weird closeted relationship that we were not really acknowledging to others and barely acknowledging to each other. And it was, looking back, and I think I really knew this at the time, it was a very unhealthy thing to be in a relationship like that. Not just trying to disparage him in any way. It was unhealthy for both of us. And, secret relationships are rarely a healthy thing. And so but that's what we were in. And it was really kind of an interesting experience to be in this sort of middle space where I was still fully in the church. I was still fully invested in that part of my spiritual self in that way. But I was also kind of trying to develop a relationship that was never going to be accepted by that church. And so when I got to Palau, I immediately got introduced to the little LDS branch. There's one branch in the entire country. They would have, maybe 40 or 50 people meet each Sunday, little tiny branch. And I was quickly called as the young men's president. And my partner at the time, who came to Plow with me, was called as the seminary teacher. And so we worked with the youth. And what we discovered was, and if you've ever been in a small branch like this, if you have any ability to serve, you kind of serve a lot. And so although that was, my only calling, I ended up doing an awful lot in that branch. I would teach Sunday school most weeks. I would teach combined youth lessons almost every week. I would speak in sacrament meeting at least once a month. I was the ward organist, the branch organist, because there were only about two of us that had any proficiency at all in playing the piano. I was organizing activities. I was sort of acting almost as a quasi counselor of the branch presidency, because they didn't really have a full branch presidency. And it was a really good and positive experience. I really loved the people in that branch. I loved the teenagers that I got to know and that I'm still close to. And I really, enjoyed all of that. I enjoyed being a part of that, and it was fulfilling to me, and it was something that I wanted to do. And I sort of had this experience where this was kind of when things really finally came to a head for me, where I had a big epiphany about what my relationship with the church was probably going to have to look like going forward. And the guy that I had moved to Plow with left the island a few months before I did, and so the last few months that I was there, I was living there alone, and I was starting to go through that terror cycle again, where I realized, okay, I'm about to move back to the US. And then what? And I was kind of doing that. And then what? Part of the conversation again. And I was really starting to get stressed, and I wasn't sleeping, and I was scared and terrified. And one night, and your listeners might judge me for this a little bit, but one night I was in my apartment. It was a Saturday night. And I said, I really want to know what wine tastes like. And this was a very, very out of character thing for me. And I promise there's a point to this story, but I thought I really want to know what wine tastes like. Very out of character. I had never, ever, ever wanted to try alcohol. I had, never thought that I would, but I was just sort of in this headspace of, I think, stress and fatigue and frustration and probably a little bit of anger at this point. And I was like, I'm going to try wine. And so I drove down the hill from where I lived to the grocery store. I walked into the grocery store. There was a wine display. I don't know the first thing about wine, of course. And I walked over and I grabbed a bottle of white wine. I didn't even know that there were different kinds, truly. And I don't know what it was that I ordered, and I'm sure it was terrible, but I grabbed it and I paid for it. And I kind of nervously went back to my apartment. And it wasn't like I was going to have a party with this. It was so clinical and so experimental. I just want to know what it tastes like, and there was sort of this thought within me. And, I think, trying to be playful with it in my own mind. But of course, there was a dark undertone to it, which was, well, if I'm damned anyway, then I might as well know what wine tastes like on my way out. That was kind of where I was. And so I get to my apartment, of course, realize that you need a corkscrew to open this thing. I don't have a corkscrew, don't even know how to use one. And so I'm, holding this bottle of wine. I have no idea how to open it. I'm trying to dig out the corkscrew with a butter knife. That's not working. I eventually break the top of the bottle off. I drink this, whatever doesn't spill out from when I break the bottle off, and got very drunk and ended up falling asleep. And the next morning I woke up, and it was Sunday morning. I think church started at 10 o'clock, and I woke up at 9 or a little after 9. And I realized I have to get to church because I'm doing all of the things that day. Right. And so I frantically get dressed, and I'm driving down the hill from my apartment toward the branch house as I'm like trying to tie my tie. And I bust into the building. And that day happened to be a day that we had a visiting general authority come to the branch. It was somebody from the Quorum of the 70, and I actually don't even remember his name now. But he was there with his wife. And that day, I spoke in sacrament meeting, and I played the piano, and I taught a combined Sunday school lesson for second hour. And for third hour, this is back when there were 3 hours of church. For third hour, I taught a combined youth lesson. And so it truly was like a kind of an extreme day where it was the Eli show at church that day. I just kind of did everything. And I remember during the second hour, I was teaching this combined adult Sunday school lesson. And I remember looking at the visiting general authority and spouse, and they were holding hands, and they were smiling and, watching me teach this lesson. And I remember thinking, I wonder if they would be smiling if they knew that I was a wicked gay dude who was drunk 12 hours ago. And there was kind of this, I don't even know if anger is the right word, but frustration maybe in me as I was watching them. And I just sort of felt like mad at myself and mad at them and mad at everything, mad at the whole system, mad at all of it, frustrated with it, sad about it. And I kind of felt like I've spent 3 decades trying so hard to fit into this, and I'm still not it. I'm still not enough. All of this that I'm trying to do and all of this service that I'm genuinely trying to give is still not enough because I'm still this wicked gay dude who was drunk 12 hours ago, and they would so disapprove of all of this of me. And so we finish the 3-hour block. And after church that day, the visiting general authority wanted to have a meeting with the branch leadership. And as the young men's president, I qualified as branch leadership. And so I was invited to participate in this meeting. And I think there were, 6, 7, 8 of us sitting around in these chairs. And we started the meeting. He said a prayer, and then he said, well, I think we can all agree that Eli was the MVP today of church. And everybody sort of laughed. And it was, he was nice. He was trying to give me credit for the fact that I had done a lot that day. And in that moment, it just wasn't, there was nothing funny, or I didn't feel like gratitude around that. And I know that he meant it from a place of gratitude, but when he said it, just this rage just suddenly bubbled up in me. And I wanted to, and I didn't. And I think I'm glad that I didn't, but I wanted to yell at him and say, he said, I think we would benefit if every branch and ward in the church had an Eli in it, is what he said. And this rage bubbled up in me, and I wanted to yell at him, well, every branch and ward of the church could have an Eli in it, but you are kicking us out. And, of course, I hadn't been kicked out yet, but that was sort of felt like the inevitable plan for me, because I couldn't contain this part of myself anymore. And once I didn't contain that anymore, then what? Then there's truly no place for me here. And the kind of, for lack of a better word, the insanity of that dichotomy that I saw and realized in that moment just made me feel so frustrated, because I just thought I am doing everything that I can to be of value in this institution, in this culture, to be a part of it. I want to be a part of this. I want to share the part of myself with these religious communities. I want to grow and benefit from the people in these branches and wards that have a lot to teach me as well. But there's no way for me to be able to stay here and do this anymore. And there was something so devastating about that and earth-shattering for me. And I drove away from the branch house that day, and that was truly the moment that it finally occurred to me, this isn't, Eli, this is not your life. This is not going to be your life going forward, and you've got to figure out a different path for yourself. I think that's a hard realization for anybody to come to. But 2 months later, I cleaned out my apartment on that hill in Palau. I gave away a bunch of stuff and packed what I could. And I moved back to Salt Lake City. And once I got back to Salt Lake City, I finally did the work within myself to not accept that I was gay, but embrace the fact that I was, and appreciate what that meant. And I finally, for the first time, let myself start thinking about, okay, this is who I am. I am a gay person. What does that mean about me? In what ways has growing up as a closeted gay child affected who I am? And I started to realize that a lot of the things that I liked the most about myself were a direct result of the fact that I was gay. And I started to realize that I actually really quite liked gay people. I really like the stories of the people who have the courage to come out. I really admire that in people. And it was sort of inspirational and motivational for me to start to think about, well, how can I be more like that? How can I actually turn what has just been terror my entire life into an opportunity to have courage and to grow into the kind of person that I always wished I could be? And so I finally, in that positive headspace and in that empowered headspace, decided it's time for me to come out. It's time for me to tell my family that this is who I am. It's time for me to tell my friends that this is who I am. It's time for me to figure out what family looks like in this new life. And unfortunately for my former religious self, who really wanted to have and maintain that relationship with the church, it's time for me to finally walk away from that and find a different path toward peace, because that one wasn't bringing me peace. So
On behalf of our listeners, great job just telling your story. You're very articulate. You have a gift of communication.
Thank you.
I sort of want to visually see that hill where you were and just see that landscape. Maybe you and Skylar will go back one day.
We went back for our honeymoon, actually.
There you go.
Yeah. And it was interesting. Well, maybe I should say a couple of things first.
Just keep telling your story. I don't want to lead your story.
Yeah.
Just wherever you want to go. You just kind of need to
stop trying to take over, Richard.
So you could pick it up with Skylar and your honeymoon, and you could just kind of talk chronologically like you're doing.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Or both.
Yeah. I'll get to the honeymoon of it all, because it was really kind of an interesting experience. But after I came out, so I really, it was 2013, late 2013, early 2014.
And you are how old at this point? I
was 30. I came out to my parents 2 months before my 30th birthday.
Okay.
And I am very, very, very fortunate in this LDS religious community that I grew up. Incredible parents. My parents are incredible people. And I always knew I wasn't afraid to come out to them. I had no fear that it was going to ruin our relationship or that they were going to be bad to me around this. I am very, very fortunate in that way. My fear of coming out to them and to anybody mostly was around my own kind of spiritual beliefs. Am I damning myself by embracing this part of myself in any way? So, once I kind of broke that down and decided that didn't make sense, I wasn't scared to come out to my parents, and my parents are very, very active LDS. They have been throughout my life. They still are. But they also, when I was growing up, they were very purposeful in making sure that we, their children, understood that family to them came first before anything else. And so truly, if there was ever a conflict between a church obligation and an obligation to family, the obligation to family won out every time. That's the kind of family that I grew up in. And so even though they're extremely devout, I knew I'm going to come out to them and they're going to have deep empathy for me and deep love for me. And they're going to want me to be happy and find peace. And they're going to be willing to listen to me when I talk to them about what that looks like. And so I came out to them and they were very supportive. They just so immediately told me that they were proud of me. And my mom made a comment to me that was really interesting. Right when I came out, I went to their house one Saturday morning and I said, I need to tell you guys something. I'm incredibly gay. And my mom said, is incredibly gay different than regular gay? And I said, no, I just wanted to make sure you guys know that there's no question about it. And my mom kind of laughed and she said, okay. And then she said
that is one of the best off the cuff, in the moment comments that just gives me and listeners an insight in your mom.
Yeah.
And she could come up with that in that moment.
Yeah. And she's a wonderful person. But she said to me right after I came out, she said, well, now that you've told us, can you just relax and take a breath? And I didn't know that I had been seen by my parents in that way for all those years. I had spent so much time, like I said, trying to distract myself and keep myself busy and stretched really, really thin. And my mom, I don't know if it was in that moment that she realized it or if this was something that she'd been thinking for a while, but she knew that had been a coping mechanism for me. And that was something that she was worried about. And she wanted me to get to a place of peace, and she could see that I was absolutely not at a place of peace. And what was really, really interesting was very shortly after that experience of coming out to my family and coming out to friends, I realized one day I had this kind of epiphany where I just felt so at peace about who I was, and I felt so calm. And I had this thought come over me, and the thought was, is this how everybody else feels all the time? And of course, everybody doesn't feel at peace all the time, but that thought hit me, and I realized in that moment that I don't think I had ever experienced peace before in my life. And it was kind of a weird realization for me that I I had not experienced peace until I got the courage to step away from my faith and embrace this part of myself. And then suddenly it was like I'd become a different person. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't frustrated anymore. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel that sadness about what my future looked like. I didn't feel terror. I wasn't waking up in terror anymore. The chronic stomach aches suddenly went away. I wasn't constantly consumed with the thoughts of how bleak my future looked. And because of that, I was suddenly able to start becoming the kind of person I wanted to be. I was able to actually start thinking about other people. And I don't think that I had really done that very much up to that point because I was so self absorbed and so consumed. And suddenly I was able to start engaging in the community in ways that mattered to me. And I was able to start building friendships and relationships in ways that I had always wanted to have friendships and relationships. And it was like coming out was what allowed me to finally become a good person. And coming out was what it took for me to finally become a person that I actually liked. You know, it was like I got to this point suddenly where I was excited to hang out with myself for the rest of my life. And up to that point, I did not want to hang out with myself for the rest of my life because I was a sinking ship of a person. And so that was a really wild revelation to have. And shortly around that time that I started coming out to my family and friends, I also started dating for the first time, truly openly, actively dating. No more secret relationships, no more of this closeted kind of one foot in the door with religion. I'm going to embrace this part of myself, and I'm going to try and find a way to build a family that I want. And so I started dating after a couple of years of dating and having some kind of fun experiences in that world. Of course, we say sometimes when you come out at a later age, not as a teenager, you sort of become a 16-year-old in a lot of ways when it comes to dating. And I really did feel like I was a 30-year-old who was dating like a 16-year-old in some ways because I had not had that kind of experience in my life before. But after a couple of years of that, I met Skylar. And Skylar wasn't living in Salt Lake City. He was living in Madison, Wisconsin at the time for work. He had grown up in Portland, Oregon in this kind of hippie family, did not grow up religious, has never really been religious at all. And we met while he was on a very, very short layover in the Salt Lake airport. We met through Tinder, dating app. And after a month or two of calling each other and chatting, we ended up starting to visit one another. And this, what I saw as a very, very impractical relationship, turned into a very real relationship. And after about a year and a half of doing that kind of long distance visiting one another thing, he ended up moving to Salt Lake City, relocating for work, so that we could be closer to one another. We got engaged not long after that, and then we got married, and we're now a family. And it's interesting. I don't think that everybody needs to be married to be full as a person. I certainly don't think that that's the case. But for me, now that Skylar is in my life, it sort of feels like I was only half a person until I met him. And he's this person that is a part of me now. And he every day lives his life in a way that compels me to want to be a kinder person to others. He's this person who I'm his biggest fan in the world. I'm obsessed with this man. But he's this person who has this absolute deep sense of empathy for others that I think would be really nice for the rest of us to have. He has this sense of justice and morality, and he sees people. He sees the best parts of people. When he looks at a person, he really only sees their best parts. And being around somebody like that all the time has an effect of kind of rubbing off on you, really, in a way. Um, he's had this ability that, sometimes when I start to get angry about something that's happening in our community, or start to get angry about the sort of faith journey of it all, he's so good at reminding me about the people that are behind that, and reminding me that everybody's got these journeys that are not simple, and life experience that doesn't look like mine. And that has been a really helpful thing to have in a partner. On top of all that, he's supremely funny, and he's just an adorable human being. And he has just kind of decided to be the kind of person who will never simplify anyone or anything down to its worst components. Last night, this is last night to give you one example. We found out that a friend of ours who is active in the church, has a calling in the Relief Society, suddenly found out that she had to hurry and throw together a funeral for a ward member within the next 24 hours. And, I was kind of listening to her story like, oh, that sounds like it's going to be stressful. And Skylar's impulse, this person who has never been religious, has never been really connected to Mormonism in any way, and by the way, has been alienated by a lot of things that happen within that organization, and has a lot of people within that organization who don't think very much of him and his decision to be in a gay marriage. That person, that man, as he's listening to our friend talk, immediately said, well, what can we do to help? Do you want me to take care of the food? I can do the food. I'll bring the food. I can take some time off work tomorrow, and you tell me what time and just where. And he was immediately coordinating and trying to figure out how to help with this Mormon funeral at an LDS church building. And, it's sort of, once again, that same idea, maybe a less rage charged for me now that I had in Palau with the general authority, which is, well, wow, this organization is really missing out on not having Skylers in it. Because any church that was filled with people like him would just be an incredible institution. He's, when you talk about what, the definition of Christ-like is, or at least the one that I kind of grew up hearing about, I don't know anybody who is more Christ-like than the man that I'm married to. But that man, would not be allowed to join the church that I grew up in. And that's a really odd thing to kind of grapple with sometimes. But so we got married in 2019, and we decided that we were going to take a honeymoon to Palau. And part of the reason why we did that is one of Skylar's college classmates and really, really close friends is from Saipan, which is a neighboring island to Palau. And she was getting married a couple of months after we were in Saipan. So he said, why don't we go to her wedding in Saipan? We'll make this our honeymoon. And then we'll just fly from Saipan Island, hop over to Palau, and we'll spend, a week in Palau. And I was excited about this idea, but I had some trepidation because my thoughts about Palau from the time that I had left it up until that point with Skylar, there was a lot of angst around that part of my life. It was sort of the end of me being in the closet, and that was a really, really hard year in a lot of ways for that reason. And I didn't know if I really wanted to go back to that island. I loved the people that I met there, but I sort of, it was almost like my memories of it were in black and white. I don't know how else to describe it, but it wasn't colorful. And I kept telling Skylar, I don't know why you'd want a vacation there. And he would say, well, it's a tropical island, Eli. Like, why wouldn't we want a vacation there? And I would tell him, well, it's not an easy place to be. And, there's kind of a heaviness there. And I don't know that I even fully realized that was all within me. Had nothing to do with Palau. It was about my own experiences there. But so we planned this trip. We decided to go, and we got to Palau, and as it turned out, it was the most beautiful place I have ever seen. And like he does with all parts of my life, I suddenly saw Palau with color. And we spent the week there and just sort of unpacking and unloading a lot of that heaviness that I had grappled with while I was there. And there was something incredibly cathartic for me in that moment to go back. The last time I was there, I was a really, really broken person who didn't know what his future was going to look like. And then now suddenly I was there with this family that I had always wanted. And I was suddenly there in this place of peace, a place that my entire life had wanted to find. And I think, that was an experience that I wish I could give so many others in this community who are struggling with what I was struggling with at that time. I wish that I could give them that experience. And I wish that I could somehow take people who are grappling from that place where I was grappling from in 2011, 2012, and just show them this is what life looks like with color. And you can actually find that color in your life too.
It's just a great segment, a great podcast. This is where listeners, I hope I'm going to ask some questions you might have of Eli. But just some notes I wrote down is Bryce Cook introduced me to the concept of double bind, father of two gay sons. Help me just understand the double bind you're in, where you'd at one point love to fully participate in church. Obviously, you have for decades, and would love to not be alone for the rest of your life. And for a straight Latter-day Saint, they're not in the double bind, but you were. And then you use the word terror over and over again. And I like you using that word. I think it's really appropriate for the reality of your situation. And it may not be terror in that moment, but it may feel in that moment. It's just terror of your future. Mm-hmm. And having to live with that for a couple decades. I love I've talked about this, listeners, the bottom of the iceberg concept. A therapist introduced me to that, is sort of often what's going on. We see at the top of the iceberg, but there's something else at the bottom of the iceberg. And your mom knew something was at the bottom of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. And moms sort of have really good intuition a lot of the times. I know my wife does. She picks up things that I would never pick up. Mm. And I like the way that she always knew there was something. And then I love that you just shifted from terror and anxiety to peace. Mm-hmm. And to me, I look for the fruits of people's experiences. And there's obviously incredible fruits of this relationship of your story. I like people as part of their own agency here in mortality to find their own path and to the work's best for them. And I think the rest of us are here to support people. And I've sensed you've had a number of people do that. There's probably been some people that have pulled away and judged you. I love this. I've always felt like if your path, listeners, is Eli type path, the same-sex relationship, you ought to approach this fork in the road where you're your very best personal self. You're in the very best spot you can be, and not be in a vulnerable spot. And I think by the time you started dating Skylar, you were your best personal self, in the sense that you were ready to be on that road. And that I've always felt healthy relationships are 1 + 1 = 3. The synergy and it seems like you and Skylar have that. Mm. And just the way you talk about him in such terms that you're a better person, you're his biggest fan. And so I just love the nature of your relationship. And it's not my judge, listeners, even though I'm giving you a lot of support for your relationship. No one can really judge a person's relationship. I think our job is just support people on what they feel is their path forward, and not look over the shoulder hoping it'll fail or trying to figure out it's not a real relationship or there's got to be something here that's not working. and just trust you that you know you the best and you know your best path forward.
Mhm.
But I love, and I think Skylar's been accepted, and to tell us a little bit about what he's doing professionally right now, because this is kind of cool news.
Yeah, he's a smarty pants, and so when he and I met, he was working for a medical software company, and he was really good at his job, but he sort of felt like he was so interested in the science behind medicine, and so he decided at age 29 that he would go to medical school. And
Wow.
yeah, and so he was an old med student. Most of his classmates were 5, 6 years younger than him. But he applied to medical school. Fortunately, he got into University of Utah, just down the street from where we live. And so he's been in medical school for 4 years.
It's really hard to get in the University of Medical School, from what I know.
It's competitive. All of this is really, really competitive. But he's a really bright person. He's extremely charismatic. He presents well. And so I had all the faith in the world that he could do it. So he went to medical school, and we've been doing that for 4 years. He's graduating next month. And I can't believe that it's about to come to an end. But we just found out that he's going to be doing a residency in dermatology for the next 4 years in Salt Lake City. So we're staying here for that. We feel extremely fortunate for that. That was another really competitive thing that he would, if he was here, he would downplay all of this, and he would be blushing. The reality is, it was extremely competitive for him to get this residency, and I'm very, very proud of him. He worked really hard at it, and so we're going to be doing that for the next 4 years. So that's what he's up to professionally. And then he and I, we're hobbyists. We have a lot of kind of hobbies, and we like to engage in the community in various ways. And so he and I together do some creative projects. I run a storytelling show.
Yeah, tell us about some of those. I'd love to connect any listeners with what you're doing in that area.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been writing a lot for many years. Since I was a child, I just always loved writing, creative writing, and especially humor writing. I really like humor writing a lot. And so for years, I've been maintaining a website where I do a lot of kind of humor writing about what I'm up to, and now a lot about what Skylar and I are up to. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to start a storytelling podcast and start finding other people to just tell mostly humor stories, just fun stories on kind of any topic. And so that podcast is called Strangerville, and I've been doing it for a number of years. It's been an awful lot of fun. And every week we release just kind of a new story from somebody somewhere in the world that we've recorded with them. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to create a live version of that podcast and just create a live storytelling show. And what we do is we find 4 storytellers for each show. We have them work on putting together kind of a 15-minute story on any topic. We workshop it with them. We help them practice it, craft it, and so forth. And then we have them take the stage and deliver these stories. And most of them are kind of humor stories in nature. And we do that show every few months in Salt Lake City. And we release the recordings of the stories on our weekly podcast as well. And so Skylar helps me with that a lot. We kind of do those events together. We engage in kind of creative projects in that way. Both of us are also very involved in LGBTQ advocacy in the community. I'm on the board of Equality Utah, and I do a lot of work there. Skylar helps me with a lot of that work. And then he also helps run what's called the PrEP Clinic, which is kind of an AIDS, HIV focused clinic on education and medication for people. Kind of medical medicine based. And so we do that kind of advocacy work. It's something that matters a lot to us. And then we try to be politically involved is another big kind of hobby for the two of us, as we stay really involved in local politics and support candidates and campaigns that we care about. And so that's kind of what we're up to between that, raising 2 really naughty puppies that run our entire lives. And that's fun too.
Listeners will link to the the things that Eli mentioned in the show notes so you can connect with the work he's doing there. You're not a one-dimensional guy, Eli. You and Skylar are doing a lot of good things and using your talents. I think we're all born with talents, and I think part of our mission here on Earth Life is how we're going to use those talents to lift the burdens of others. I've always felt that's part of mortality, is lift the hands of those. And it seems like you and Skylar are doing that in lots of different areas. If you've got time, I'd love to talk about Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think listeners and me are just heartbroken, and you've lived in Ukraine. You know these people. One of the Twitter threads you shared just put tears in my eyes, where you talked about how, I hope I can remember it enough that you can build on it, is just this woman that took you from house to house or something. Just part of their culture of just how welcoming they were to you as a missionary. So anything you want to talk about Ukraine, just go for it.
Ukraine it's an unbelievable place. And this last month has just been like, I feel like I'm living inside of a nightmare. I really do feel like I've been in a nightmare for the last month. But one of the very, very small positive things that has come out of this for me anyway, is seeing people around me realize how incredible of a country Ukraine is and how incredible the people are there. So, I served my mission there in Western Ukraine from 2003 to 2005. And then after I stayed really connected with Ukraine, I have been back many, many times.
Wow.
I've been there to study. I lived in Moscow briefly and worked as a lawyer in Moscow in 2009. And I've kind of gone to Ukraine in an educational way many times, and to study culture and history and language. And I've got a lot of friends there that I've stayed really connected with. And so it's a place that has felt like a very, very big part of my last 2 decades. Skylar and I have gone there together as well, and he's gotten to know a lot of the people in Ukraine as well. And so, the story that you're referencing, I think, is I've been sharing a lot of kind of experiences of things that have happened that I've witnessed in Ukraine over the last 2 decades. And one of them was as a missionary, when I was in Ukraine, there was this little village where there were, I think, 10 or 15 church members lived in this tiny, tiny village. And it was this beautiful, beautiful farm country village. We'd have to take this little van public bus out to this village that ran out there once a day. So we'd get out there in the afternoon, and then it would pick us back up a couple of hours later. But so once a week, we would go out there and we would just go from house to house in this village and visit all of the people. But inevitably, what would happen every time we did is we'd go to the first house, and then those people would want to come with us to the next house. And then those people would want to come to the next house. So by the time we got to the last house, it was just this big caravan of people walking through this farm country together. And I have the most vivid images of, those sunflower fields with blue sky over them, out in the most beautiful place that you can imagine, in these little cottages all kind of poking up around the sunflower fields and other farmland, and that kind of smell of earth and soil. And we're just walking through this feeling, for me, so far away from home, so far away from home in those moments, but in a really positive way. And we would get to that last house, and everybody, these are people who saw each other every day. It's a tiny village, but they just all acted like they were being reunited after 50 years every time they saw one another. And it was just this big caravan party of people. And to me, that's what Ukrainians are, is their sense of community is just unbelievable. It's unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. Ukrainians are an extremely blunt people. You never wonder what they're thinking about you, which is one of the things I really like about them. I tend to be similar, actually. I really like that about them. And if you're doing something wrong, they're not afraid to just tell you, that's stupid. What you just did is stupid. You understand that, right? They're just kind of that way, but they're not vicious or mean about it in any way. It's just their version of kindness is integrity, and it's honesty in relationships. And so they'll show up for one another, and they'll call one another out. and they're willing to be called out. And it's just this really, really neat group of people. And so anyway, when in 2014, there was a lot of consternation in Ukraine. There were some really big protests and some really violent responses to those protests by the Ukrainian government. And what ended up happening in early 2014 was there was this battle over the center of Kyiv between civilians and kind of armed forces that were acting basically on behalf of pro-Russian, influences. And these civilians ended up with makeshift weapons, ended up chasing out the armed resistance and burning down a good portion of their center area in the process. And right after that, probably 2 months after the fighting had ceased there, I went over to Ukraine to visit some friends, and I wanted to see kind of what had happened and reconnect with some people. And I ended up walking through that center square area that was still completely charred and barricaded with tires and furniture that people had kind of brought out. And the cobblestone had been ripped from the streets and piled high and used as weapons against armed forces. And I ended up walking through this, and it was peaceful at that time, but people were still kind of there, just sort of in the aftermath of it all, singing together and cooking over open fires. And it was this really surreal experience. And right at that time, the fighting between pro-Russian forces and Ukrainians shifted to the far eastern part of the country. And so what a lot of people maybe don't fully realize right now is that Ukraine has been fighting that war actually since 2014. It feels like a brand new war to us because, so much has happened in the last month. But this is actually a war that's been ongoing. And I've had friends go and fight in that war, and I've been worried about them for years. And so a month ago, we've of course been hearing reports that troops were amassing around the borders and so forth. And I've been really worried about that. And I've been communicating with friends in Ukraine and trying to understand how they're feeling and so forth. And that night that it was suddenly getting reported that there were bombs heard just outside of Kyiv, Skylar and I were watching the news, and I just, this sense of sadness, just came over me. And we, like a lot of people, I think, ended up staying up very, very late that night and just watching the news. And I was, messaging with friends, and some of them, who were 5 years old when I met them and are now adults, and some of them who are, elderly people now. And I, trying to communicate with as many of them as I could. And hearing the fear from them was really heartbreaking. And I just felt so helpless, and over the next 3 or 4 days, I fell into this fog that I don't know that I've ever experienced anything like this, but it was just suddenly, I was just completely consumed with this sadness and fear about what was happening over there, and this total sense of helplessness. And I hated how helpless I felt in those few days. I'm communicating with friends, and I don't know what I'm supposed to say to these friends. Stay safe. I love you. I wish there was something I could do to help. I don't know what to do right now. And after 3 or 4 days of that, it was Sunday evening, just after the new invasion had begun. And I was watching the news, and I hadn't really slept. I really had not slept in 3 or 4 days. And I opened up Twitter, and I'd been tweeting about the Ukraine conflict for the past few days and sharing messages from people so that people could understand in the United States what people in Ukraine were saying about what was happening. And I opened up Twitter, and I just tweeted, and I said, I need to do something. I want to put together a fundraiser. And within minutes, literally dozens of people were messaging me and texting me and calling me and saying, I want to help. I want to help. And by the next morning, I had, with the help of some really incredible people, had scheduled and arranged to have 2 big fundraisers happen that coming weekend. So in 4 and 5 days away, which was just, I don't know what I was thinking trying to pull off events like that. I do events, I do the storytelling shows. They take a long time and a lot of effort to put together, and these were going to be events that were a lot more complicated than those other things that I typically plan. But I had just so many people. I literally had over, I think, 100 active text chains happening by mid Monday morning. And it was very, very overwhelming. And I was trying to figure out how to delegate things out. And okay, why don't you put together a silent auction? Why don't you try and figure out how to find us venue space? Why don't you know? And it was just a lot of kind of that logistics planning, that coordination. And that evening, that sort of took my day and that evening. And then the next day, and I was just, I looked like hell. I truly did. I had not been sleeping, and I was not shaved, and I don't think I'd changed my clothes in about 3 or 4 days. And that evening at about probably 7:30, Skylar, who had been kind of helping, and he was having his own very, very, very busy week. He's in the middle of doing graveyard shifts and rotations and all these different things at the hospital. And he looked at me and he said, this isn't sustainable. You can't do that. You can't do this. You need to get some rest. And I was like, Skylar, I can't get rest. We're doing these events. I'm trying to raise money to send over to some humanitarian organizations. And he took my phone from me. He fed me some melatonin, and he was like, you're going to bed right now, and I'll handle this from here. And I later found out that he spent the rest of that evening not only kind of helping arrange things for these fundraisers that we were throwing, but he had also started emailing my coworkers and telling them not to bother me. And he had emailed several attorneys that I work with and said, if you need something from Eli, call me and I will decide if he needs to hear from you. And it was just, he was, protecting me, and it was really helpful. And I slept for, I think, 13 straight hours, which I don't usually do. And woke up the next morning. It's amazing what rest can do, because I woke up the next morning and suddenly I was like, oh, I can do this. We can do this, and it was just that fresh, freshness sort of really helped. But so we ended up putting on these 2 events. We found some people who offered to match donations, and some really, really generous offers from people inside and outside of Utah, actually. And so by the end of the week, we had ended up raising $134,000. And then since then, we've brought in a little bit more. And so now we're around $155,000. And that was, I could not believe that response. I truly thought going into that, maybe we can raise 5 or 10 grand this week and send it over to a couple of humanitarian organizations that are on the ground right now in Ukraine, trying to provide medical supplies and so forth. But we ended up cutting checks for, around $75,000 to organizations that I really like and believe in, and believe are doing really great work right now. And that, in a lot of ways, that week and that experience doing that really helped cure the feeling of helplessness. I wasn't helpless anymore, right? And I think the reason why we had such an incredible response from our local media and from people who wanted to help run the events and people who wanted to donate space and donate flowers and donate food. Literally everything that went into doing these events was 100% donated. We didn't spend a penny putting these events together. I think the reason why so many people wanted to do that and donate money as well is because so many of us were feeling that helplessness. And it was like, I kind of realized, okay, well, I'm familiar with Ukraine. I'm familiar with people there. I speak Ukrainian, and I have a platform. I have an online platform. And so what I can do is I can collect all of that helpless energy from people that within my sphere and put it to use somewhere. And that response was just so much bigger than I had really anticipated. And I'm really grateful for that.
Away with words, that helpless energy, and channel it somewhere. Listeners that help contribute to this and care about Ukraine, thank you. Thank you for all the people that help make this happen. It seems like Eli, wherever you go and your fingerprints touch something, good things happen. You may not want to say that completely about you.
I don't know that that's true.
But, you just have a life that seems like where you go and where you're committed, you're lifting the hands of others and you're bringing peace and help and comfort. And in this case, significant financial help. And I'm sure a lot of emotional help to people you interacted with. And I love you've been gifted a lot of things. And I love you using your gifts to lift the burdens and help others. We're probably out of time, but I just keep thinking of things to talk about. You may need to go home. You said a line earlier that I wrote down word for word that I thought was a great place for all of us to be excited to hang out with myself the rest of my life. What a great place for anybody to be. Mm-hmm. And I think our heavenly parents would want that for all of their children as part of their journey in mortality. And also I'm struck by the fact that, because your road within the church didn't fit, that sometimes you've had to figure out things in a complex way that gives you skills to solve complex things. Mm-hmm. That's a hypothesis that's been running in my mind, is that your thoughtfulness, your having to draw from multiple sources, your own life journey has built within you skills that allow something like Ukraine to happen, and just work with multiple communities across multiple sort of areas to bring people together. I don't know if that's true, but I just thought about that. I also thought about Equality Utah. We've really talked about that, but I'm Troy Williams, which I think is Troy's role. What is Troy's role?
He's the director of Equality Utah.
I remember when I became an ally, and I've never shared this story, and someday I'll maybe have Troy on the podcast. Love to have him on the podcast, but he spoke at Affirmation. I was a brand new ally, and he said to the audience, he says, if you're in the church, stay in the church. Mm-hmm. I was really kind of surprised that somebody out of the church would say that to me. And I realized that Troy is a bridge builder.
Oh, yeah.
And I just thought everybody that left the church wanted everybody else to leave the church.
Yeah.
And I realized some do, but I realized some don't. And I then have been really impressed with Troy.
Yeah.
Tremendously impressed with the work he's done. Some of the best work that I think's been done legally, and you're much more familiar with that than I am, in our state, and has been a role model for our state, for many other states. And I think it's just terrific. And as listeners may know, that I didn't think something would ever happen. Elder Oaks quoted Troy Williams in his Southern Virginia address. And I was on Twitter one day, and Troy said, I never thought that would happen.
Yeah.
I think Elder Oaks is trying in some ways to build this bridge by quoting Troy Williams. And you may know more of the backstory on that.
Yeah, what I can say, Troy is, I've never met anybody who's better at their job than he is. And one of the reasons why he is so good at his job is he has true empathy for everybody. Troy loves everyone, truly, sincerely loves everyone. And he's been a huge example to me in the last several years. He's become a very, very close friend of mine. But he has an ability to kind of see people where they are and love them where they are. I had him actually tell a story on Strangerville about his mother's funeral. He went to his mother's funeral, I think it's maybe 15 years ago now, or 20 years ago now. And at her funeral, her friends had planned to have an Elvis impersonator there at her funeral and to do Elvis impersonation, songs. And Troy was just so angry at that because he thought it was so tacky. And he told this story about going through this experience of his mother's funeral and having sort of a peace come over him where he realized, my job isn't to judge people for what they are, it's to love them where they are. And that has been a guiding principle in his life. And you can see it if you spend any time with him. You can see that in him. That love and empathy and joy for life really emanates from him in a really beautiful, beautiful way. And I absolutely think that you should invite him on, and you can tell him that I volunteered him to be on this podcast. Yeah.
I think listeners of the word Zion And I used to, because I grew up in a very homogeneous part of Salt Lake City where everybody was the same as me. And I thought that was what Zion is. Maybe that's okay to think that. But Zion to me is finding common ground. It's not sameness, is what I'm trying to say. It's finding unity and diversity. It's finding the way to work together. To me, sameness isn't we all become in the same political party in our congregations, but we look at our differences in a positive way to help solve significant problems. And to me, that's Zion to me. So Troy Williams, you, and hopefully this podcast is creating a Zion where it's not sameness. There's a lot of differences between you and me, Eli. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, there's more things in common than there are differences. Mm-hmm. And I think those differences working together to solve things is Zion for me. You mentioned your parents are active in the church, and do you want your parents to leave the church? And if not, why not?
No, I don't have any desire for my family to do any particular thing with their religion. I think their faith journey needs to be their own. They have to own it. I don't wish one way or another for them. I, of course, want them to be open-minded. I want them to continue to embrace and support me. But there's never been a part of me that has hoped or wanted them to leave as long as they feel like their religion is providing value to them and it's helping make them better people. Then that's great. Now, if I might have a different feeling of that if I felt like the religion was hurting a person in one way or another, I might have kind of different hopes or wishes for them, but that hasn't been my experience with my parents.
Listeners, I think it's a tremendous example of grace. That even though this faith didn't, at the end of the day, have a place for you, as you felt your best path forward is what you're on now. And there's fruits of that seem really wonderful. It's the reality. And I just acknowledge that there isn't a place for you. And it makes me say that we should further put our arms around you with the reality of that instead of the real villains of what's happening in Ukraine. Obviously, it's not people like you and Skylar. And we should walk with you and we support you and celebrate your successes and want you to be successful. And I love the principle of self-determination, listeners. We just let people self-determine their best path forward and try not to be too prescriptive. I do invite people to stay in the church, so I'm not completely neutral on that. I do invite people to, but I also, and I think it's part of our doctrine, is let people self-determine or let people own their agency and just support them and leave any judgment at the feet of our Savior, who's the perfect judge, and just walk with people. So that's the way I navigate that. I invite listeners, and I feel like obviously we're not at the finish line here. I feel like it would be wonderful, and Skylar and Eli had more of an opportunity to participate in our church. And I don't know what that looks like. I sort of don't advocate for how this works out, or I just invite us all in our circle of influence, if we're an ally, to consider what we can do within our circle of influence to improve the experience for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and use that allyship in a way. But also, like the circle of influence, for me, that sort of gets me out of the anxiety world, Eli, because there's a lot of things I can't control. And I've sort of learned to say, this is my circle of influence. And everybody's got to, as an ally, figure out what that is for them. It may just be, it just may be your ability as a parent to just create a safe environment in your family for all your kids, whether they're straight or LGBTQ. If you're a local leader, to create a feeling that everybody's welcome here. I think at a congregation level, everybody should feel welcome, but it's hard when you don't hear consistently kind things about people like you. Mm-hmm. So that's all I've got. Eli, do you have anything else that came to your mind that we didn't get to or you'd like to share?
I think my kind of just tagging on to what you said as sort of a closing thought, I think it is a noble pursuit to create space wherever you are for people who are different than you. And for myself, I'm not interested in going back to the church. That's not something that I truly don't think at this point that there are changes that could be made at the church that would get me to come back. I've kind of found a different path for myself, but I do wish that there were people that there was more room for people who want to stay in that institution to feel more welcome than I felt when I was trying to stay in it. And so I absolutely applaud anybody who is like you, Richard, working to make a more welcome place for those types of people who want to be in that space.
Listeners, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Eli, particularly for sharing your story. My advice is write your own story. You've got to own your own story, but take principles from all the stories you're hearing on these podcasts from all different walks. Different people are walking this, and use this to make, I think when you have better information, you make better decisions in your own journey. And this has been a wonderful story, principle-based story of just Eli being really honest and vulnerable. Terror is the word that I wrote down a few times where you were. And it's, to be in that spot and the realities of your situation and that double bind and where you are now, just support you. And I'm glad you're on the podcast. And thanks, listeners, for listening. This is Eli McCann and Richard Ostler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.